Well, hey there, kiddos. Here is your solving using square roots video. This should be the second flap on your little purple and white foldable that we started last week or over the weekend. And so we're going to solve using square roots. And there's a big thing in the middle of your first page right here that says use this method when there is only a squared term. And what that means is if you only have an x squared, and so that's the only time you should use this method. You should not use this method if you have a trinomial that is 2x squared plus 3x plus 8. It should just have the x squared term, because otherwise this method is there's too much happening. So the best time to use this method is when there's just a squared term. The reason that's on there is because solving by square roots is actually pretty easy, and so as a rule, kids, when they learn this, they start wanting to use this method for everything, and it doesn't work for everything. It only works when there's only a squared term. So here are your steps, and this is in your foldable. The first thing you have to do is get the squared term alone. So whatever thing is to the second power, it's got to be by itself. So in this first example, the thing that is to the second power is all of this in parentheses. This x minus 10, the whole thing is squared. So that needs to be alone, but this 2 is not part of that. So the first thing we're going to need to do is divide both sides by 2. So what we'll have left is x minus 10 squared is equal to 100. And the second step says to take the square root of both sides. So to undo something that is squared, we take the square root because they are opposites or inverse operations of one another. If I take the square root of the quantity x minus 10 squared, then I'm left with just x minus 10. If I take the square root of 100, hopefully you know by now that that's 10, because 10 times 10 makes 100. If you aren't sure, you press second and x squared on your calculator and then type 100 and it will tell you that it's 10. And what this says here for number 3, it says don't forget the plus minus. What that means is that when I take the square root of 100, there's really two answers. There's a positive 10 and a negative 10, because, excuse me, if I do positive 10 times positive 10, it makes positive 100. And if I do negative 10 times negative 10, that's also a positive 100. So when I take the square root of a number, it could be either the positive or the negative, because they will both work. So we have to include them both. And so the next thing says to finish solving if necessary. Well, we have to here. I've got to get x by itself, so I'm going to add 10. But you have to be careful over here. When you add 10, you have to add 10 to positive 10, and you have to add 10 to negative 10, because like it says right here for number 5, you should have two answers when you're done. So the first answer, I'm going to do positive 10 plus 10, and that's going to be 20. And then I'm going to do negative 10 plus 10, which makes 0. So my two solutions to this problem are x equals 20 and x equals 0. And what that means is that if I graph this function onto my calculator, it's going to cross the x-axis where x equals 20 and again where x equals 0. That's where my parabola will have solutions. It's where it'll cross the x-axis. So let's try another one. So look at number 2 here. Number 2 says x squared equals 225. This one's pretty straightforward. The squared term is already by itself, so we're just going to take the square root of both sides. And the square root of x squared is just x. The square root of 225, you'll probably need to type into your calculator, because that's probably not one that you have memorized. And it should be 15. And remember, because we took a square root, it's plus or minus 15. And so you have two answers. X equals 15. And x equals negative 15. And you don't have to write it out. If you put this x equals plus minus 15, this counts as your two solutions. If you want to write it out so you can see both of them, that's fine, but this is okay if you put the plus minus in front. Just don't forget about the plus minus. Alright, so number 3 here, we've got to get the squared term by itself. This is the term that's squared, the x squared. So the first thing I'm going to do is add 25. So I have x squared is equal to, 4x squared is equal to 25. And then I'm going to divide by 4. So x squared is by itself. Well, 25 does not divide by 4 evenly. So we're going to leave it as 25 over 4. Don't even try to divide it and make a decimal or anything. Just leave that fraction alone, because now I can take the square root of both sides. And yes, we can take the square root of a fraction. Remember, it's going to be plus minus. The square root of the numerator, 25, is 5. The square root of the denominator, 4, is 2, and so this becomes plus or minus 5 over 2. If you want to simplify that out, you could say it's plus or minus 2.5, but there's nothing wrong with the fraction, even though it's improper, whatever. It's okay to keep that as a fraction. So let's do number 4. We want to get the x squared by itself, so we're going to subtract 100. So I end up with x squared is equal to negative 100. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides. And I'm going to want you to use your calculator for this one, because the square root of x squared just becomes x. But if you type into your calculator the square root of negative 100 and you hit enter, you should get an error. And I'll even show you on my calculator. If you do second x squared, so your square root symbol, and you do negative 100 and you hit enter, it should give you an answer like this. You should get an error that says non-real answer, because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. There's no way to multiply a number times itself and get a negative. It just doesn't happen. If you multiply a positive and a positive, it makes a positive. If you multiply a negative and a negative, that's also a positive. You can't multiply a number times itself and get a negative. So you can't have a square root of a negative number. And so for this one, we can't do this. And so what you're going to have to say is that there is no solution to this problem. So what I want you to do is pause for just a second, try number 5, and then come back and check your answer. So if you subtract 5 from both sides, you get x squared is equal to 0, and then you take the square root, you just get x is equal to 0. You don't have to put the plus minus on this one, because there's no such thing as a positive 0 or a negative 0. X is just 0. And so you only have one answer in this case, and it is totally okay. It's not a big deal, but x is just 0. So do the same thing. I'd like you to try 6 and 7, and then come back and check your answers. Okay, for number 6, I divided both sides by 4 first so I could have the squared term all alone, and I got x plus 2 squared was equal to 81. Then I took the square root of both sides, so I got x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus 9. Don't forget that plus minus. When I subtracted 2 from both sides, remember that meant I had to subtract 2 from positive 9 and from negative 9. And so when I did positive 9 minus 2, I got x equals 7. And when I did negative 9 minus 2, I got x equals negative 11. So here are my two solutions for number 6. Now for number 7, first thing I did was subtracted 80. So I had negative 80 equals negative 2x squared. And then I divided both sides by negative 2. So I got a positive 40 equaled x squared. And then I took the square root of both sides. Well, the square root of 40 is not a perfect square. If you go in your calculator and you type the square root of 40, you get a long decimal happening. Well, I don't want to write out that whole decimal. I also don't want to round. So I'm going to leave my solution as a radical with a square root. So I'm going to write it as x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 40. And it's acceptable to leave your answer like that. We're not going to do anything with it. I just need to know that that's my answer. And so we'll stop right there and call that our solution. So let's do this last little word problem. A zookeeper is buying fencing to enclose a pen at the zoo. The pen is an isosceles right triangle, which means that the two legs are the same length. That's why they're both marked X. There is already a fence on the side that borders a path, so there's a fence over here already. The area of the pen will be 4,500 square feet. And the zookeeper can buy fencing in whole feet only. So he can't go to Home Depot and say, I need 21.5 foot of fencing. He has to buy it in whole feet. So the question is, how many feet of fencing should he buy? Well, what we're trying to find is what this X equals. And what information we have is the area of that triangle. So I'm going to use that. I know to find the area of a triangle, it's base times height divided by 2. So I'm going to plug in what I know. My base and my height are the same thing, and so x times x makes x squared. So I have x squared divided by 2 equals 4,500, because that's what they told me in the problem was the area of the pen. Well, to get x squared by itself, I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 so that I don't have this fraction any longer. So I have x squared is equal to, well, 4,500 divided by 2 is going to be 9,000. And then I have to take the square root of both sides. And this time, when I take the square root of both sides, we're only going to take the positive value because the negative value doesn't make any sense here. We're talking about how many feet of fencing he needs. You can't have negative feet of fencing. You can only have the positive value. So all we care about this time is the positive. You don't have to do the plus minus because this is a real world actual situation. So the positive value only. So x is going to equal, and remember it says that we have to get whole feet of fencing. So we're going to do the square root of 9,000. And it comes out to 94.868 blah, 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 blah. Well, I need that to be whole fencing, whole feet. And so 94.8 rounds up to 95 feet. So he is going to need 95 feet of fencing, but that only takes care of one side. In order to take care of both sides, I'm going to have to multiply that by 2. So to get his entire how much feet of fencing he needs, we're going to do 95 times 2 because we've got to do that twice. And that gives us 190 feet of fencing. And this is what he needs. This is your final answer in order for to tell the zookeeper how much fencing he's got to buy. If he only buys 95, he can only cover one side. Make sure that you cover both sides of that triangle that don't have a fence yet. So that is solving by square roots. We'll practice this when you come to class tomorrow, and hopefully the copy machine will be working and I can actually make you copies. I will see you then.